and welcome. I am DEJI360. The Nigeria Governors Forum has warned that implementing the proposed 60,000 naira monthly national minimum wage would push many states into financial ruin, crippling their ability to fund critical development projects and basic services. The governor stated this after a meeting on Friday. Now, recall that the labor unions had on Monday embarked on an indefinite strike action after rejecting the federal government's 60,000 naira offer as the national minimum wage. But they later announced that they would relax the strike action after 1 week, for 1 week now, to give room for further negotiations with the federal government, which had promised to increase the wage above 60,000 naira. However, the governor said the 60,000 naira wage is not realistic and unsustainable, arguing that if implemented, it would force some states in the country to be borrowing to pay workers' salaries. In fact, part of their statement actually said it might actually lead to some states using their entire federal allocations now to pay salaries. The governor further said all parties involved, especially the labor unions, must consider the socio-economic variables and settle for an agreement that is sustainable, durable, and fair to all other segments of society. Joining me now on the program to discuss this and more is Nelson Ekujimi, who is a public affairs analyst and, of course, a political affairs analyst. And also joining us in Abuja is Ogbonna Ikuku, who is a policy analyst. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming on the program. Let me start with you, Ogbonna. It's like with the position of the governors, it's like we might be going back. I mean, labor unions now might be going back on strike. You never can tell after 1 week.
I see. These are the realities that we have found ourselves in as a nation. Now, it goes to show that a lot of people still need to do their work and do it properly. What am I trying to say? The labor union, when they decided to embark on a strike, should have done their homework. They have different, compartments in their group where people are supposed to have done an analysis on income of the state, then be able to factor a few things, and then arrive at a particular amount of money. So it goes to show, because the kind of conversation that should be going on now is, how did labor arrive at the cost that they are asking for? Now, the state also will come and throw things open and say, these are our own analysis, not just saying governors staying on top of their heads, okay, this would throw us into not being able to pay salaries or borrowing money to pay salaries. How did they arrive at that? So these are the statistics that must be on display in the public domain at this point in time. So, I mean, Nigeria has come a long way. We shouldn't be having conversations like this without evidence, fact, empirical evidence. So there has to be, because as far as federal government is concerned, as far as Nigerians are concerned, we know that since the removal of subsidy, more monies have been going to the state to FAC account. So more monies that they've been receiving, what are they really doing with the funds? So it gives everybody a job to do. So plus labor, plus the government, both at the subnational level, everybody needs to sit down and do the work. Give each other time to go and work out this whatever agreement with empirical evidence.
And Nelson, the issue of time is what the labor unions, I would say, do not have. They've suspended the strike for just 1 week. I think we're now 3 or 4 days into that suspension. So by next week, you would expect that if nothing comes out, I mean, from the Tripartite committee negotiating this minimum wage, then they will be forced to go on strike again. And now you have the governors coming out to say they would not be able to pay even the 60,000 naira. And that's after the federal government had actually said it is willing and to pay something higher, which was the reason why they decided to call off the strike. So where do you think we go from here?
Well, I think we should also know one fact that the 1 week ultimatum or the 1 week grace by the labor unions is not cast in stone. But for me, what this has brought out to the fore is that it seemed Labour was more concerned or concentrated on the federal government, while neglecting the other stakeholders in the tripartite, committee, because the committee was supposed to have been comprised of federal government representatives, state governments, as well as the private sector. So while Labour was calling for, disagreeing over 60,000 naira, you want to ask, what was the state governments, what were they offering to pay? What was their ability? Because right now, it's like we are back where we were before. And so for me, it shows clearly that, as a people, as a labor union, that, we didn't get our facts right. Because the federal government cannot, compel states to pay above what they can afford.
Sorry to interject. You just raised an important point there, because before now we had thought there was an agreement among, maybe with the exception of Labour, but we had thought there was an agreement between the states,
the private sector,
as well as the federal government that they were going to pay 60,000. But with the governors now coming out to say, look, they can't even pay 60,000, which means there was no agreement even before Labour went on that strike.
And also, let me also remind us that in 2019, when there was that agreement on the 30,000 minimum wage, we recollect that the governors refused to sign, and that is why till date, 5 years after the enactment of that law, so many states are yet to comply. So it tells you clearly that, we still have a lot of work to do. You look at the revenue of these states, realistically, some states will never, ever be able to pay that amount if you look at their workforce. For example, I looked at the allocation of Kogi and Kwara State for February. I saw that they got an allocation of between 7.3 billion to 7.4 billion. And they have a workforce of about 30,000. And that is if everybody on the workforce is earning 60,000 naira. Don't forget that in the workforce, we have people from level 1 to level 17. And if I say 30,000, you can be rest assured.
60,000.
If I say 30,000 workforce, you can be rest assured that it could be about 35 or 40 or 50,000. So if the state gets 7 billion, and at the end of the day, she uses 2 to 3 billion to pay workers' salary, what will be the amount that will go to the judiciary? What will be the amount of that budget, of that revenue that will go to the legislature? Then you look at developmental projects. So realistically, the 60,000 naira is unaffordable by the states, except if we want to delude ourselves. So
maybe some states are able to afford it.
No, like some states could. States like Lagos could, they could pay it without, batting an eyelid. But for some other states, I can tell you for free, even Labour itself said some states were still paying 15,000, some were still paying 8,000 in violation of the 2019 law. So it tells you clearly that, Labour was more interested in the federal government. Maybe they are leaving the states workers to bear their burden by themselves.
Ogbonna, do you get that impression? Especially, for instance, we heard not quite long ago that the Minister of Finance had submitted a document containing a template of the federal government now, and everybody keeps talking about this template as if it's the template that would apply to states. I would assume that template would be about the federal government because, of course, the finance minister does not control the budgets of the various states. So this is becoming a very complex issue. What do you make of this complexity, especially as we can clearly see that the negotiation definitely won't be an easy nut to crack?
Yeah, it brings everyone to that point where we begin to see how Nigeria, the dysfunctional, issues around governance in Nigeria. Now, if you do your stakeholder mapping, one of the first critical persons you must bring into the conversation will be the subnationals and then the private sector. So if you all don't sit on a round table and agree, and then you come up with a compendium of salaries and wages that you're going to pay to people, it begins to show that the work is not yet done. So the federal government is discussing as federal government. So the state governors have to now discuss as state governors. But be that as it may, the reality now at this point is what needs to happen is there has to be that confluence. There has to be that agreement that the states can renegotiate their own minimum wage based on their income dynamics.
But the labor unions are not having that at all. They are not having it at all. And because this is actually what played out, I think, in 2019, and they are just not having that at all. Yes. That it has to be done at a tripartite level, and that, at a national level, that you can't allow the states to begin to negotiate their own minimum wage.
No, see, if you notice that time, I even liked the labor union at that point in time. They had facts, they had things to throw around, show in the income dynamics of states, how much the wage bills were, and then what they needed to do. So, but at this point in time, I don't think this particular labor union, I'm sorry to say, I don't think they are ready to have this conversation, because if they had facts, it makes it difficult for the Governors Forum to say what they just said after their meeting, because they would have been able to do the analysis, say in Zamfara State, this is your income, this is what we see, based on productivity, you should be able to pay this amount of money. And realistically, that should occur. So mine is, if we're having conversation as if we are just having, people just sitting in a room to have a conversation. No, first of all, you do your mapping, know the kind of people, the kind of conversation you're going into, have your facts, empirical evidence, and then you can now sit down and have your conversation. But for me, at this time, the conversation is not robust, and it's not making so much sense.
Nelson, everyone agrees, even the governors too agree that, that there should be a pay rise, that you should have an increase in what people earn, especially in the national minimum wage now. But the issue is by how much. That's where the issue is, by how much. Because the governors have said, look, yes, there's a need to raise wages, but the issue is by how much. But with what is playing out now, how do you think this can be resolved?
Well, like I said, we are back where we were before. That's a song by an Afro musician. But be that as it may, for me, I'm worried that as much as I am not begrudging Labour for asking for a wage raise in view of the economic realities, I believe there are some indices in the economy that should be paramount. And this has been my concern over the years whenever there's this demand for wage increase. I talk about the cost of living, the cost of foodstuffs, transportation, housing, education, health. I believe a serious labor union should be able to put on its thinking cap and say this is the only way that whatever raise we get will not pale to nothingness. Because severally, even when government has increased wages, it becomes something that cannot even take the worker from the office or from the factory to the bus stop. So how do we address the soaring food inflation that is bedeviling us? If no matter what you earn, I recollect somebody was telling me when he started work, he was earning less than 1,000 naira, and with 1,000 naira, he could afford to take a car loan, he could afford 3-bedroom flats. But is that the case now? Absolutely not. So I expect Labour to put on its thinking cap. It should not be about wage increase. Those indices that, consumes whatever wage you are earning are the things we need to address.
So
and in that way...
But shouldn't the government too put on its own thinking cap to say, look, how do we address this problem? Because the way it is, you look at all this issue about, it's like you're throwing money at the problem. It really doesn't solve it. I understand your point. But then shouldn't the government too put on its thinking cap to say, look, how do we address this problem other than, throwing money at it? How do we, for instance, bring down the cost of foodstuff? How do we bring down the cost of transportation? How do we bring down the cost of living generally? That should be the remit of the government anyway. I
agree that the government also has a role to play, but bringing down the cost of these things is a collective responsibility. And as a labor union, when you are aggregating your demands, you must also be able to aggregate the way forward. Your demands should not only be about what you earn, because if you look at the organized labor, for example, they constitute just about 5% of the workforce, the working population in Nigeria. Over 90% of the working population are in the informal sector and the private sector. We're talking about 60,000 naira that was offered by the federal government. Thinking Just like you rightly said, I thought it was an agreement from the Tripartite committee, only for us to, for the fact to now, shoot out that 60,000 was the proposal from the federal government. You want to ask, what was the proposal from the state governments? What was the proposal from the private sector? Because as we are now, if we continue to insist on this wage increase, definitely there will be job loss. A lot of private sector, employers will have to, trim down their workforce. Even the states, as we speak, 5 years after the enactment of the law.
But that is if they choose to comply.
Even at 30,000 naira, they are not complying.
That is if they. But Ogona, where do we go from here? How can all of this issue be resolved? How can we avoid the next strike action?
Now, Labour needs to understand that they have a job to do. As also the government all realizes that they have a job to do. Now, the job is, first things first, there has to be that agreement. We have to all sit down and agree that we have not done a good job at all levels. So Labour must go back and do its analysis to find out what is the realistic wage that they should be earning. Two, they also need to talk about being productive, because when we talk about productivity, it's actually centered around the bureaucracy, which is the labor itself that will do the work. So they need to also be able to tax themselves. These are the things we intend to do going forward as we receive these monies. These are the things we want to do to help the country to become solvent, to help the economy to become, stronger. Then again, lastly, the labor needs to also know that they are the only component of this whole conversation that have been consistent. So if refineries did not work, it's not the executive that made it not to work or the politicians that made it not to work. So they should stop having arguments about what a senator is earning and what. No, that's not the conversation. They are the ones who, if they had done their job in making refineries work, I'm looking forward to that day that a labor union will go on strike because someone in the executive arm of government gave an instruction that is anti-productivity, and they decided to go on strike because of that. So those are the kind of labor we are looking forward to. The kind of labor we see in other parts of the world, where you see the productivity, taking the front burner in conversation.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for coming on the program and sharing your thoughts with us. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, we'll take a short break and we'll be right back. And this time we'll be talking to someone in the private sector to get their own view on this whole drama now that is unfolding over the national minimum wage. Stay with us, don't go away.
Opinions are free, facts are sacred, but truth is universal.
How, in practical terms, can we, for instance, de-escalate the tension?
When you go into public office, you must be ready to answer to the people.
We know where the enemy is. 3 places. The Lake Chad Basin, the border area between Nigeria and Cameroon, and then the Sambisa Forest.
On DEJI360, we give you a complete dose of everything. Opinion, facts, and undiluted truth.
I hardly believe what politicians say in this part of the world. A new Nigeria is possible, a future is possible.
We delve into the issues, dissect it so that you can understand it, and use it to take action.
I don't think there's any need for any governor to look for grant for ranching.
DEJI360, dissecting the issues.